The devastating revelation morning that changed everything started like any other. I was sipping coffee at my mother's kitchen table when she dropped a bombshell that would shatter my world completely. Rick deserves this opportunity more than you ever will, she announced with startling conviction. Her words hit me like a physical blow as she casually explained how she'd already transferred my grandmother's entire $200,000 inheritance directly into her boyfriend's bank account. My coffee cup trembled in my hands. What exactly are you saying, Mom? He's endured tremendous hardship, Juliet. That divorce devastated him financially. He lost absolutely everything. You're still young with unlimited potential. Your entire career lies ahead of you, she delivered. This life-altering news with the same casual tone she'd used to discuss weekend plans. Completely oblivious to the devastation she was causing, I'm Juliet Thompson, 27 years old, working as a marketing coordinator at Amberlin Ventures in Charleston, South Carolina. 3 months earlier, my cherished grandmother had passed away, leaving me her life's savings. This wasn't merely money, it represented decades of love, sacrifice, and unwavering faith in my dreams. She had explicitly wanted me to use these funds for purchasing a home or launching my own business. Mom, that inheritance was specifically designated for me. Grandma made her intentions crystal clear. Your grandmother would completely understand, she interrupted dismissively. She always championed helping family members, and Rick is family now. Rick had appeared in our lives 8 months ago, and something about him immediately raised red flags. While superficially charming, always praising my mother's cooking and bringing flowers, there was something calculated about his kindness that made me deeply uncomfortable. At 52, he claimed to be a struggling contractor, though I'd never witnessed any evidence of actual work. Besides, my mother continued, you earn decent money at that marketing position. Rick's need is far greater than yours right now. I forced myself to remain composed despite my racing heart. When did you make this transfer? This morning. I wanted to inform you before you discovered it through the bank. Her tone suggested she expected gratitude for this minimal courtesy. The casual manner of this revelation told me everything about how little my feelings mattered to her. This wasn't an impulsive decision. She had been planning this betrayal for weeks, possibly months. The woman who raised me, who taught me about integrity and fairness, had stolen my inheritance and handed it to a virtual stranger, but instead of exploding with rage or dissolving into tears, I felt something entirely different, a cold, calculating composure settling over me. Looking at my mother, this woman who had just committed the ultimate betrayal, I smiled. No problem, Mom. I understand you love him. The unraveling bond me childhood had been challenging, but I'd always believed my mother and I shared an unbreakable connection. After my father abandoned us when I was 12, we faced the world together. She worked exhausting double shifts as a nurse to keep us afloat, and I strived to be the perfect daughter, excellent grades, no trouble, always helpful with household responsibilities. My grandmother had been our foundation during those difficult years. Every Sunday meant dinner at her house, where she'd secretly slip me $20 bills and share stories about building her catering business from nothing. She had arrived from Ireland with only a suitcase and a dream, eventually saving enough to purchase a small house and fund my mother's nursing education. Education and independence, she would tell me, are the only things no one can ever take away from you, darling. When cancer claimed her last spring, I thought I had exhausted all my tears. The funeral was intimate but beautiful, and afterward, her attorney read the will. The house went to my mother as expected, but the savings all to OOO came to me with a specific note for Juliet's future dreams. Initially, my mother seemed genuinely excited for me, even helping research investment options and discussing potential business ventures. That was before Rick entered our lives. The changes in my mother's behavior became noticeable about 6 months ago. She started canceling our weekly dinners, claiming exhaustion or mysterious prior commitments. When I visited unannounced, I frequently found Rick there, sprawled across our couch as if he owned the place. He would greet me with inappropriately familiar hugs and call me kiddo in a way that made my skin crawl. Your mom has shared so much about you, he would say, his smile never reaching his eyes. She's incredibly proud of her successful daughter. Gradually, I noticed subtle changes in how my mother spoke to me, small comments about my spending habits, questions about whether I really needed my own apartment when I could save money living at home. Suggestions that perhaps I was being overly ambitious with my career goals. All these observations, I now realized, had been systematically planted by Rick. Most troubling was how my mother seemed to diminish around him. The strong, independent woman who had raised me alone began deferring to his opinions on everything from television shows to her personal finances. She even started dressing differently, abandoning her comfortable nursing scrubs for the revealing outfits he preferred. Sitting in my mother's kitchen as she justified giving away my inheritance, I understood that the woman I had known and loved was disappearing. Rick hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my mother too. But I wasn't going to let him win. Not without a fight. The investigation begins. He left my mother's house that afternoon with my mind racing through possibilities. The betrayal cut deep, but beneath the hurt was something else, a cold determination I had inherited from my grandmother. She hadn't built her business by being passive, and I wouldn't reclaim my future by wallowing in self-pity. My first call was to my grandmother's attorney, Mr. Harrison, who had handled her affairs for over 20 years and had known our family since I was a child. "Juliet, I'm deeply sorry about this situation," he said after I explained what had happened. "Your grandmother was very specific about her wishes regarding that inheritance. Is there any legal recourse?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Unfortunately, since your mother was the estate's executor and the money had already been distributed to you, she technically had access to transfer it. However, there might be other options we can explore." We scheduled a meeting for the following day. As I hung up, I realized I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Rick might have charmed my mother, but I suspected his sob story about losing everything in a divorce might not be entirely accurate. That evening, I did what any skilled marketing coordinator would do. I researched social media profiles, public records, business licenses, court documents. By I had painted a very different picture of Rick Morrison than the one my mother had been sold. Far from being a victim of circumstances, Rick was a serial manipulator with a clear pattern of targeting older women. I discovered 3 previous relationships over the past 5 years, each following an identical script. He would meet them through dating apps, present himself as a down-on-his-luck contractor or small business owner, and gradually infiltrate their finances. 2 of these women had filed restraining orders against him. Most revealing was a civil court case from 18 months ago where his previous girlfriend had successfully sued him for $15,000 he had borrowed and never repaid. But what really captured my attention was his business history. Rick claimed to be a contractor, but his only business registration had been suspended for failure to pay taxes. He had no contractor's license, no insurance, and no legitimate source of income. The man my mother was supporting was essentially a professional con artist. Armed with this information, I felt the pieces of a plan beginning to form. Rick had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated me. He saw a young woman who could be dismissed and discounted. But my grandmother had raised me better than that. Legal loopholes and family betrayal. Me meeting with Mr. Harrison the next morning confirmed my suspicions. Legally, my options were limited. My mother had technically been within her rights to transfer the money since she had been named as a backup beneficiary if anything happened to me. It was a loophole that Rick had clearly researched and exploited. However, Mr. Harrison said, leaning back in his leather chair, "There are some interesting clauses in your grandmother's will that might apply here." She was very concerned about protecting her legacy from what she called fortune hunters. He pulled out a thick folder and began reading. "There's a provision that if the inheritance is used for purposes contrary to her stated wishes, specifically if it's given to someone outside the family for personal gain, the executor can be held legally responsible for breach of fiduciary duty." My heart skipped. What does that mean exactly? It means your mother could be required to repay the full amount plus penalties and legal fees. But we would need to prove that Rick manipulated her into the transfer and that it goes against your grandmother's explicit intentions. I thought about the research I had compiled the night before. What if I could prove that Rick has a history of financial manipulation and that he specifically targeted my mother for her assets? Mr. Harrison's eyebrows rose. That would certainly strengthen our case considerably. Gathering evidence. He spent the next 3 days gathering more evidence. I contacted Rick's previous victims, and 2 of them agreed to speak with me. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to what I was watching happen to my mother. The pattern was always the same: charm, isolation, financial dependency, and then exploitation. But I needed more than just evidence of Rick's past behavior. I needed to catch him in the act. That's when I decided to pay my mother an unexpected visit. I arrived at her house on Thursday evening with takeout from her favorite restaurant and a carefully planned conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her as we sat at her kitchen table. "Maybe you're right about Rick needing a fresh start." My mother's face lit up with relief. "Oh, Juliet, I'm so glad you understand. Rick has been so worried that you hate him." "Not at all," I lied smoothly. "In fact, I'd love to get to know him better. Maybe the three of us could have dinner this weekend?" What I didn't mention was that I had already arranged for a private investigator to be watching the house. If Rick was running the same con I suspected he was, he would start pushing for more money soon. The inheritance was just the beginning. Sure enough, when Rick arrived home an hour later, he seemed surprised but pleased to see me there. "Juliet, your mom said you were upset about the money situation. I hope there are no hard feelings," he said, flashing that practiced smile. "Of course not," I replied. "Family takes care of family, right?" The conversation that followed was enlightening. Rick had clearly been planning his next moves carefully. He casually mentioned investment opportunities he was looking into, home improvement projects that would increase the property value, and a business venture he was considering that would set them up for life. Each suggestion involved spending more of my mother's money. "The thing is," Rick said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "opportunities like this don't come around often, but they do require some capital to get started." My mother was hanging on his every word, already mentally calculating how much she could liquidate from her retirement savings. But what really sealed my resolve was what happened after Rick went to the bathroom. My mother leaned across the table and whispered, "I think Rick might propose soon. He's been hinting about wanting to make things official." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about my inheritance. Rick was planning to marry my mother and gain access to everything she owned: her house, her pension, her life insurance. I was watching a predator systematically destroy everything my grandmother had worked to build. The professional investigation, the next phase of my plan, required patience and precision. I spent the following week playing the role of the supportive daughter, agreeing with my mother's decisions and even offering to help Rick with his business research. What he didn't know was that every conversation was being carefully documented. My private investigator, a woman named Janet who specialized in fraud cases, had been busy gathering evidence of Rick's activities. She discovered that he was not only pursuing my mother but had been simultaneously dating 2 other women in nearby cities. "He's running what we call a long-term romance scam," Janet explained during our meeting at a coffee shop downtown. "Most people think of these as quick online cons, but Rick's version is more sophisticated. He invests months building emotional dependency before making his financial moves." She handed me a folder full of surveillance photos and financial records. "The good news is that his pattern makes him predictable. The bad news is that your mother is already in deep." The evidence was overwhelming. Rick had been using my inheritance money to fund his other relationships, including paying for hotel rooms and expensive dinners with his other targets. He had also started applying for credit cards using my mother's address, apparently planning to run up debt in her name. But the most damning evidence came from a recorded phone conversation between Rick and one of his other marks, a widow named Patricia from Savannah. "The nurse is completely hooked." Rick's voice came through clearly. "I've got her convinced that her daughter is selfish and ungrateful. By Christmas, I'll have access to everything: the house, the pension, the life insurance. Then I can cut the daughter out completely, and we'll be set." Hearing him refer to my mother as the nurse while planning to destroy our relationship was the final confirmation I needed. This wasn't just theft, it was a calculated attack on our entire family. The confrontation that weekend, I put the next phase of my plan into motion. I invited my mother and Rick to dinner at an upscale restaurant, claiming I wanted to celebrate their relationship properly. What they didn't know was that I had also invited someone else to join us. "Mom, Rick, I'd like you to meet my friend Janet," I said as the private investigator appeared at our table. "She's been helping me with some research for a work project." Rick's face went slightly pale, but he maintained his composure. "Nice to meet you, Janet. What kind of research?" "Actually, I specialize in investigating fraud cases," Janet said pleasantly, taking the seat next to my mother. "Julia asked me to look into some concerning financial activities in the area." The color drained from Rick's face entirely. My mother looked confused, glancing between Janet and me with growing alarm. "I don't understand," my mother said. What does this have to do with us? I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder Janet had given me. Mom, there's something you need to know about Rick's background. What followed was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I watched my mother's face change as Janet methodically presented the evidence, the previous victims, the court cases, the active investigations in other cities. Rick sat frozen, clearly calculating whether he could still salvage the situation. This is ridiculous, he finally said, his charm facade cracking. Juliet is obviously jealous of our relationship, and she's making this all up. But the evidence spoke for itself, and my mother wasn't stupid. She had been manipulated, but she wasn't blind. The real shock came when Janet played the recorded conversation. As Rick's voice filled the restaurant, describing his plans to isolate my mother and steal everything my grandmother had worked for. I watched 20 years of my mother's nursing experience kick in. She might have been vulnerable to emotional manipulation, but she knew a predator when she saw one. Justice and Recoverith restaurant scene ended with Rick storming out, claiming, "We were all crazy and would regret messing with him." My mother sat in stunned silence, processing the reality of what she had been drawn into. "There's more, isn't there?" My mother asked quietly as we sat in Janet's car outside the restaurant. I nodded. "Mom, we need to go to the police tonight. Rick has been using your information to apply for credit, and there's evidence he's planning to escalate his financial crimes." Detective Williams at the Charleston Police Department was already familiar with Rick's activities. Apparently, they had been building a case against him for months but had been waiting for enough evidence to ensure a conviction. "Your mother's case could be the key we need," Detective Williams explained as we sat in the police station at PM. "If she's willing to cooperate, we can add her testimony to what we already have from his other victims." My mother surprised me with her strength. Despite the emotional trauma of realizing how thoroughly she had been manipulated, she insisted on making a full statement that night. The next morning, Rick showed up at my mother's house demanding entry. What he didn't know was that Janet's team had installed security cameras the previous evening, and everything was being recorded. "You think you can just destroy my life?" Rick shouted through the front door. "I know where you work, where your precious daughter lives. This isn't over." The threats were exactly what the police needed to arrest him immediately. By noon, Rick was in custody, and Detective Williams was explaining the charges: financial fraud, identity theft, criminal threats, and violation of a restraining order from his previous victim in Savannah. The scope of Rick's criminal activities was staggering. He hadn't just been running romance scams, he had been part of a larger network of financial criminals operating across 3 states. By the end of the week, I had my inheritance back, plus interest and damages that Rick was required to pay as part of his plea agreement. He was facing 15 years in federal prison, and his entire network was being dismantled. Healing and moving forward, the aftermath of Rick's downfall rippled through the community in ways I hadn't anticipated. Detective Williams contacted me to say that our case had helped them identify and assist 12 other victims across 3 states, with total recovered damages exceeding $1.2 million. But the personal impact went beyond the financial recovery. My mother and I began attending family counseling together, working to rebuild the trust and communication that Rick had damaged. Manipulators look for existing cracks in relationships. Our counselor explained, "They don't create problems, they amplify ones that already exist." My mother surprised me with her determination to transform her experience into something positive. She began volunteering with a local organization that helped elder abuse victims, using her nursing background and personal experience to provide support and education. "I want other women to recognize the warning signs I missed," she told me. "If sharing my story can save even one family from what we went through, then maybe some good can come from this nightmare." The inheritance money, when it was finally returned to my account, felt different somehow. It wasn't just my grandmother's gift anymore, it was a symbol of resilience, of family bonds that couldn't be broken by manipulation, and of the importance of standing up for what you believe in. I decided to use part of it exactly as my grandmother had intended, to start my own marketing consultancy specializing in helping small businesses build authentic relationships with their communities. It seemed fitting to use money that had nearly been stolen through deception to build something based on trust and honesty. Justice Sir Vedrick Morrison received a 15-year federal sentence for his crimes, with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. The judge specifically noted that Rick's systematic targeting of vulnerable women showed a callous disregard for human dignity that warranted the maximum sentence. Meanwhile, the three women he had been simultaneously manipulating each received full restitution, and two of them started a support group for romance scam survivors that now helps hundreds of people across the Southeast. Looking back on those months of betrayal and recovery, I realized that my grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the money she left me. It had been the strength and wisdom she had instilled in me to fight for what was right, even when the battle seemed impossible to win. The inheritance was restored, justice was served, and most importantly, my mother and I had rebuilt our relationship, stronger than ever before. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from what we gain, but from what we refuse to let others take away from us. This experience taught me that family bonds, when tested by deception and manipulation, can either break completely or emerge stronger than ever. Thanks to my grandmother's wisdom, my mother's ultimate courage, and the dedication of professionals like Janet and Detective Williams, our family chose strength over surrender. And Rick, he learned the hard way that some young women are far more formidable opponents than he ever imagined.